Good morning and welcome to the 17th meeting in 2019 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Can I begin with just giving apologies on behalf of Murdo Fraser. The first item, and it should obviously the usual thing for mobile phones please. The first item on our agenda is to welcome our two new members, Gordon MacDonald and John Mason, into the committee, and I invite them to declare any relevant interests please.
I have nothing to declare.
I think the most relevant thing for myself is I'm a member of ICAS as a chartered accountant.
Okay, thank you for that declaration and welcome. I'd also obviously like to take this opportunity to thank Emma Harper and Willie Coffey for their hard and diligent work during their time on the committee. The second item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Referendum Scotland Bill, and I welcome our first panel, Professor Justin Fisher, who's the Head of Department of Social Political Sciences at Brunel University, London, and Dr Alan Rennick, who's the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit at University College, London. Thank you very much for the written submissions you provided to the committee and to the others obviously who have done similarly. It was very helpful. So I think we'll just go straight to questions. Therefore, my area of question is the written evidence that we received highlights the need for a minimum period of at least 6 months between the referendum legislation coming into force and being implemented. In your views, does that 6-month period apply to the legislation for each referendum, or does it apply from the date of any referendum, any framework bill for referendums being in place? I ask that question because it seems to me that almost all of the required rules and regulations would be in place in the passing of any framework referendums bill, and the intention behind the Gould Convention, therefore, of 6 months, will have been all but met. But yeah, that's just my own perspective. You may have a different viewpoint on that, and I'd like to understand it from whoever would like to take the floor first.
So I would agree with you. Firstly, I should say thank you for inviting me to be here today. I would agree with you that the Gould principle is that the rules of a referendum should be clear at least 6 months in advance. And that implies that if all the rules are in place, and if the only matter to be decided subsequently were the question itself and the date, then the Gould principle wouldn't be broken by setting a referendum somewhat less than 6 months in advance of the actual poll. That said, I think it is clear from experience in Scotland and throughout the UK that allowing a decent amount of time for any referendum is really important. It's vital, above all, in order to allow voters time to hear from the campaigns, reflect upon the arguments, and come to their judgment. But it's also important, as Justin has particularly pointed out in his evidence, his written submission, so that there's fairness between the campaigners in their preparations for the poll, and also it's important for administrative purposes as well. So while the Gould principle, I think, does apply simply to the rules of the referendum, I would encourage the view that doing referendums slowly and carefully is always the better approach to take.
Thank you very much, Alan. Justin?
I would echo Alan's thoughts on that. I think it's important to recognise that referendums are relatively unusual mechanisms, and almost by definition they're going to attract an element of controversy. And so it's really important not to rush important considerations in the preparation for a referendum, and that can include the agreement on the question wording, which can be very difficult. But as I say in the evidence, the designation process, while it worked very well in the Scottish independence referendum, it worked very badly in the EU referendum in 2016. And I think the lesson that we're learning before our very eyes at Westminster level is that rushing things is perhaps not a good way to proceed in terms of an orderly process. So my advice, even if it might seem unusually lengthy, would be in line with Alan's, and that it would be better to be conservative about the time period rather than try and get things rushed through.
Angela, do you want any supplementary at that stage?
I suppose I was quite interested in the actual referendum period. You know, I appreciate, you know, there's a time frame around, you know, the passing of legislation. Dr. Rennick, you said that the referendum period should be determined on a case-by-case basis. And I suppose what I'm interested in is, you know, I wondered what bearing the type of issue or the subject of the referendum, you know, would have on the referendum period. And there was also other, you know, points about separating out, you know, deadlines for registering participants, you know, from the controlled period. And it just seems to me how do you get to that point where you're based on good principles about what's too long, but also what's too short a referendum period?
Yeah, so just to clarify, I didn't say the referendum period should be decided on an ad hoc basis. I said it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that some variation might be appropriate. And what I was really thinking there was that there are some issues where a particularly long referendum campaign may be appropriate. And, you know, I think there's wide agreement that the fact that the campaign in 2014 was as long as it was actually a good thing for allowing the issues really to be dealt with in considerable depth. But I think the more important point is that a minimum referendum period should be defined. And at the moment, so far as I can see, the bill does not define a minimum period. And the absolute minimum period that is generally internationally seen as being the real limit of what is acceptable is 4 weeks. So I've suggested in my evidence that at the very least a minimum 4-week referendum period should be allowed for. That is taking account of the fact that the bill proposes that designation of lead campaigners should happen before the referendum period. So in effect that creates 4 weeks for applying for designation, 2 weeks for, or 16 days for the determination of the designation, and then 4 weeks for a campaign. So a total of 10 weeks, which is mirroring the PIPERA framework, the UK-wide referendums framework. A number of people in their evidence have suggested that actually the minimum should be greater than that, and the minimum referendum period should be 10 weeks, with designation taking place earlier than that. I think that would certainly be better. So, I mean, an absolute minimum of 4 weeks, I think, is fundamentally needed. But a minimum of 10 weeks, I think, would be a better approach.
Mm-hmm. Professor Fisher?
Again, I share Alan's view on this. I don't really see the case for a rush, given that referendums are comparatively rare and generally on issues of great importance. So rather than trying to push these things through in a hurry, you know, even the PIPERA framework, as I've outlined in my evidence, can disadvantage sides on a referendum where there's more than one competitor for designation. And I think the lesson from 2016 very strongly is that should be avoided, and therefore that elongates the period before the control period proper. It may be that the control period could be a relatively short one, but I think it's very important that the preparations are done over a longer period of time.
Yeah, okay. And I'm conscious that the International IDA recommends that legislation should, I quote, allow for an adequate period for the campaign. And obviously there's been variation of practice over the piece with the EV referendum, you know, from the point of legislation to polling day, it was like three months. Don't remember anybody complaining about that. But I suppose I wondered, in terms of the Venice Commission, which talks about the need for fundamental aspects in statute and more detailed technical parts in regulation, where do issues of timing, where should they fit? Are they fundamental and should be in statute, or are they more about regulations? And as Dr. Rennick touched upon, that there's some scope potentially for looking at things on a case-by-case basis.
I think the experience of the 26 referendum suggests that if it is left to governments to decide the period between legislation and the referendum date, it can cause immense difficulty. And that's precisely what we saw in respect of the campaigns on the Leave side in the build-up to 2016. So, there is an opportunity here, it seems to me, to learn from the experiences of major referendums within these islands. And it strikes me that a very good lesson has been learned, that if you give governments the ability to introduce a shorter period between legislation and referendum, they will take it, and that it seems to me to be not democratically very healthy.
I think the key thing is that the minimum period is specified in primary legislation. If on a particular case it is deemed appropriate to extend that minimum period, then I don't. To me, that doesn't cause problems. But I think that the minimum period is absolutely fundamental. And Justin, in his evidence, sets out a very strong case for extending that minimum period beyond the PIPERA minimum period for the reasons he's given.
Okay. And a final question, Convener, just a more general one, whether the panel members agreed or accepted that the current bill before us, having been derived on past practice, is, relatively full of examples of good practice. But where do you think it could be more, I think someone said in evidence, more forward-looking and a bit less conservative, and where there could be more room for democratic innovation?
If I could start with the regulatory aspects, the innovation is more Alan's bag. It strikes me that we do elections in this country pretty well because we do them very regularly. We don't do referendums in this country consistently well because we haven't had many of them. We had a very successful referendum in this country in 2014. We had a very unsuccessful referendum from the perspective of the workings of the legislation in 2016. And it does seem to me that we need to learn from that. Because one of the big lessons of the 2016 referendum was the ability of campaigners, whether registered, or unregistered, to effectively use the legislation to render things like the spending limits to be virtually meaningless. That cat is now out of the bag, and I think there is a real danger that unless that's closed, if we have any further referendums, that we will problems will arise. So relatively few problems arose in 2014. In the light of the experience of 2016, if steps aren't taken in respect of spending limits, I fear that there may be difficulties in Scotland. And this is an opportunity to address some of those regulatory issues, which I highlight in my report, in my evidence, specifically around the spending limits for permitted participants and non-registered participants.
Can we come back to that issue of the spending limits? Because I know from your evidence, I think you said it was not that wasn't fit for purpose. So we need to, I think, delve into that a bit more. Angela, are you?
Well, other than I was interested in Dr. Rennick's views on scope for democratic innovation.
The bill is based very strongly upon a 20-year-old Westminster legislative framework, and given that this is an opportunity to establish a new legislative framework, it would seem to me it would be good to really think hard about what changes would help Scotland be at the forefront of democratic practice rather than a couple of decades behind democratic practice. So on the regulatory side, I mean, in addition to the points that Justin has raised, there are many big questions clearly around digital campaigning, the rise of digital campaigning. And there's a lot of work going on in Westminster and Whitehall on that front. They all accept that the existing rules are not fit for purpose. I think it would be important for the Scottish Parliament to push forward on that front as well. Going beyond those regulatory aspects, I mean, I do set out in my evidence that I think there's real scope for deepening the democratic quality of referendums in Scotland in two principal areas. So one is thinking about the quality of information that's available to voters during a referendum campaign. And I think in particular there are real lessons that can be learnt from Ireland, where, of course, citizens' assemblies have been used preceding the referendums, most notably those on same-sex marriage and on abortion, repealing the Eighth Amendment. And there's lots of evidence, and perhaps Theresa Reedy in a couple of weeks will be able to talk more about this. But there's lots of evidence that those citizens' assemblies have helped the quality of debate that has ensued in the subsequent referendums, has helped surface the range of arguments, has helped identify arguments that were weaker and stronger, and has led to a much higher quality debate during the campaigns. And then the other issue that I have raised is the issue of how we avoid the kind of mess that Westminster is now in with respect to Brexit. And the difficulty of the Brexit referendum, and in terms of its structure, an independence referendum is essentially the same, is that it is a referendum on a basic principle, not a referendum on a precisely worked out plan. A difficulty clearly arises if people vote for a principle, but then the version of that is worked out through subsequent negotiations is remote from what was promised during the first referendum. And my view, and the view that was set out by the Independent Commission on Referendums that we ran, that reported last year, is that if you have a referendum on a broad principle, what we call a pre-legislative referendum, and what is subsequently delivered does not match what was promised, then you ought to have a second referendum. And that second referendum ought to be baked into the process from the start, so that it's clear to voters what they're actually voting for. And that is the way that you ensure that there is a proper democratic mandate for what subsequently happens. It's the way that you ensure that the Parliament doesn't get mired in debates about what actually is the will of the people, that it is possible for Parliament to stand above that kind of question, and therefore you don't end up with the mess that I think people on all sides would have to accept Westminster has got itself into.
Quite a wide area now, so I want to try and focus down into some of the more technical bits of the bill, but I would just say to Professor Rennick, of course, there was a distinct difference. What happened in the referendum in Scotland in 2014 was there was a white paper that existed, and that didn't exist prior to the referendum for the EU. But whether we thought the white paper was good or not, at least it was there. Adam Tompkins.
Well, I'm not going to be drawn on the white paper, convener, although I'm quite tempted given that introduction. But I want to go back to, we've covered one aspect of the regulation-making powers that are in the bill, namely the very broad power that ministers would enjoy under this bill if it's enacted in its current form to specify the referendum period. But there are at least two other aspects of the bill that it seems to me give, or would give, to ministers very significant powers. You've just said, Dr. Rennick, that we shouldn't be too wedded to PREPARA as a model because it's 20 years old, or nearly 20 years old. But one of the key differences between this bill and the United Kingdom legislation is that, unlike in UK law, under this bill, ministers would have the power to call a referendum. Is that an advance or is that a retrograde step?
That's a retrograde step. I think that's very clearly a retrograde step. International practice is very clear that referendums should supplement the representative process. They should not be used in order to circumvent the representative process. And calling a referendum is a big decision. We have seen in recent years the extent to which a referendum can have fundamental effects upon politics, society, how we all think of ourselves. And for a referendum to be called, I think that should be subject to the very greatest possible scrutiny in advance. In the Irish case, I would advocate that scrutiny should not just be in the Parliament, it should be wider as well and include citizens' assemblies, other kinds of processes. But at the very least, it should be in Parliament. And it should be subject to the greatest possible scrutiny within Parliament. And that is only possible if a referendum can be called only through primary legislation, not through secondary legislation. So overwhelming international practice would indicate that. The vast majority of referendums are post-legislative referendums where a bill has gone through Parliament and then there's a proposal to put that to a referendum. So they don't circumvent Parliament. And for the Parliament here to allow itself to be cut out of the process, I think would be highly undesirable.
Does Professor Fisher agree with that?
I have nothing further to add. I think Alan makes the case very strongly, and I agree entirely.
Thank you very much. The other example which you referred to, or the main example, Dr. Rennett, which you referred to in your written evidence, is the power in Clause 37 for ministers to be able to amend the Act by regulations. And on that, you say that this power should be, and I quote, defined more tightly or removed. If we were not to remove it, but if we were to define it more tightly, what tightness of definition would you advocate?
Well, I think the principle should be that such powers do not exist unless there is a specific justification for them. One example that comes up later in my evidence is a power to call a citizens' assembly in relation to a referendum. Because this is a relatively innovative way of doing referendums, I wouldn't advocate putting in a requirement into the legislation saying there must be citizens' assemblies, but empowering ministers to do that kind of thing, I think, would be sensible. There may be other aspects of the detailed regulation of referendums where it would be sensible to have that in secondary legislation rather than primary legislation, but I would follow the advice of the Electoral Commission on that. I wouldn't want to try to define that boundary myself.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I just clarify one issue, because it was raised by Angela Constance in her questioning to you earlier, and I don't want to retread the ground about specifying the referendum period. But Angela will, I'm sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she said that nobody objected to the referendum period for the AV referendum in 2011 being 3 months. But that, of course, was a post-legislative referendum, not a pre-legislative referendum, which, in your judgment, would be a material difference on the question of timing. Is that right?
Does that necessarily? I'm not sure if that necessarily makes a difference, but it could make a difference. And the Electoral Commission's view in 2011 was that a longer period would have been preferable, because the legislation for the AV referendum did include a range of regulations pertaining to the campaign, and therefore it didn't entirely conform to the Gould principle. Right. So there should have been a longer period there, really.
I mean, I think whether anybody objected at the time is neither here nor there. The experience of 2016 suggests that, with the benefit of hindsight, the short period was unwise and created significant difficulties for campaigners and for the fairness of the campaign.
That's very clear and helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, can I just pick up on Adam's second question around the regulation? Because this is not all black and white in this area in terms of the powers that ministers have, is it? Because sometimes these powers are there for incidental or unexpected circumstances that arise. But while mostly legislated for by primary legislation in the EU Referendum Act of 2015, of course, important parts of the EU referendum were legislated by secondary legislation, including the date of the referendum period, and for periods of reporting and spending during the campaign. Now, I can understand from the evidence you put forward that that sort of area of regulation by ministers, not done by primary legislation, would be unsatisfactory, but there must be areas where there's unexpected consequences or incidental things that need to be tidied up as part of a process of any legislation.
Yes, but I think the difficulty that has arisen with the PIPERA framework is that because that is now 20 years old, we've had an accretion of various bits of additional rules in the primary legislation for each referendum and in the secondary legislation for each referendum. And now is an opportunity for the Scottish Parliament to take all of that and provide a consolidated set of rules in primary legislation. I mean, it is, you're right, it is the case that circumstances change and rules need to change, and it's difficult to get primary legislation through on all of those matters just because...
So, to use a Scottish Parliament term then, if this committee was to consider recommending to the government, I'm not saying we will, some sort of super affirmative process around regulations, would that help?
Yes, but there are some things that are currently proposed for regulations that should not, in my view, be in regulations.
I understand that. Okay.
So we're talking about section 37 here, not section 1, just to be clear.
Yes, but the section 37 provision at the moment allows any aspect of the bill or the act, as it would be, to be amended by secondary legislation, and that seems to me inappropriate.
Sorry, even with super affirmative, that would be inappropriate in your view?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Justin?
Where I would differ from Alan here is that there's a danger of characterising PIPERA solely in terms of referendums. PIPERA may be 20 years old, but in respect of elections, it's been remarkably successful, and there have been amendments to the legislation periodically adjusting donation declaration caps on loans, for example, and that's been done very successfully. And there's a great deal of satisfaction amongst participants in elections with the way in which those are run. So I think that when we're thinking about PIPERA, I think it would be reasonable to say that whereas elections have been successful in this 20-year-old framework, which needs updating in respect of digital campaigning, I would definitely agree. But the aspect in respect of referendums is rather different because they've been so infrequent and they have thrown up issues which probably weren't well thought through when the original act was passed.
Thank you. Tom?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Just picking up on section 37, it seems that the policy intent is effectively a keeping pace power, but effectively to keep pace with best practice in legislation concerning referendums and policy. Is it perhaps possible to characterise it as that being the policy objective that not being met by the wording, and is there such a way that that provision within the bill could be modified to be more tightly defined so that it's clear that these powers are specifically for keeping pace with best practice and could not be abused by a future executive?
Well, I think there are two principal difficulties with that clause for me. One is the generality of the clause, that it applies to the whole of the Act, and there are no elements within the Act that are kind of protected, as it were. But secondly, I don't have the full wording in front of me, but it says that changes can be made to the Act in relation to any enactments or proposed modifications of enactments, which seems to me an extraordinary power to confer upon ministers, that they can propose changes to the Act based upon proposed modifications of other legislation. Whether those modifications have gone through doesn't indicate at what stage that proposal must have reached. So I mean, I would defer to lawyers on this point. I'm not a lawyer. But I mean, it sounds as though a minister could propose some kind of change to another enactment, and on that basis would be able to propose via secondary legislation a change to this Act. And that just seems like a very strange power to give to a minister.
Is it possible that the wording could be tightened in such a way as to avoid that dubiety, where it was clear that this would be about utilising these powers for legitimate proposals made by reputable bodies, for example, that its power is specifically for allowing this Act to keep pace with best practice without the need to resort to primary legislation?
One change would simply be to remove those words on proposed modifications. And whether it would be desirable to introduce provision in relation to recommendations from the Electoral Commission, for example, that is something that you might want to pick up with the Electoral Commission. I wouldn't have a strong view on that.
Is there anything you would like to add to that, Professor Fisher?
I mean, I agree with Alan on this. It does seem to me to be extraordinary that these powers would be conferred, and even with the tightened wording, the definition of legitimate would be a matter for debate. I think it would be safer. I mean, most issues that come up for change are fairly major ones, such as the digital imprints. And that can go through primary legislation. So I share Alan's concerns about this, and it seems to me to be an unnecessary part of the Act.
Okay. If I can just bring you back, Dr. Rennick, to some of your earlier remarks concerning the powers conferred on the executive earlier on in the legislation. Describe this as a retrograde step, and I think the term you used was it would circumvent the representative process, which is quite strong language. If we take that, if we're going to be precise about language and its literal meaning, it is to go round. But of course, within the bill, the proposal is for affirmative procedure, which would necessitate a minister coming before a committee, seeking the approval of the committee, having already been scrutinised by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, and then would require a vote in the chamber. Would you perhaps suggest maybe circumvent the representative process is a slightly too strong a description? And further, would you perhaps, is there an argument that a super affirmative process could perhaps allay some of the concerns that you've expressed?
So it's a circumvention of the full representative process, in the sense that the full process, and you know, we have processes of primary legislation set out as they are for a reason, that is the degree of scrutiny that is deemed appropriate for major decisions, and a decision to hold a referendum is a major decision, and therefore it seems to me it should be subject to the greatest level of scrutiny within the representative system. And I don't think any form of scrutiny of secondary legislation matches the scrutiny that is given to primary legislation. I mean, if it did, what would be the point of doing it? What would be the point of doing it through secondary legislation rather than through primary legislation? And it seems to me the reason for doing it through secondary legislation is that it's easier to do. But that isn't how the representative system is set up. The representative system is set up to have checks and balances. And there is a long history in less healthy democracies and in non-democracies of using referendums in order for a strong leader to get round parliaments. Scotland should not be going there and should not be opening itself to suspicion that it could be going there.
You've used, again, this term of going around Parliament, but of course, for clarity, it would have to go through Parliament. And if I can make one final point, convener, just one final question, is that this bill proposes effectively to encapture all of the aspects of a referendum shy of the question, the date and the referendum period. And there have been previous referendums which have been legislated for via primary legislation. They have contained a range of aspects. I think, for example, compared to PIPERA, which covers campaign rules but not process, process would be covered by this bill. So effectively, all there would be to decide would be the question, the date and the period. And there would still be an opportunity for full parliamentary scrutiny. A committee can take evidence on this, and it can take evidence out both written and from ministers, and there can be a debate within Parliament. Is it not really a case, I'm trying to understand what the government's motivations are, that this is more about giving certainty, having a defined time period, rather than any sort of nefarious motivations that perhaps your remarks imply?
So the biggest decision that is left unsettled by this legislation is whether to have a referendum. Yeah? And then within that, there's the question of what the question is, what the timing is, and so on. But whether to have a referendum is a really, really fundamental decision. And I think there are three differences between any secondary legislation process and a primary legislation process. One, there is less scrutiny on secondary legislation. Two, secondary legislation is unamendable. Three, symbolically, it's saying somehow this is of secondary order importance. And I don't think any of those is desirable in the context of any referendum.
Thank you.
Justin, do you want to, before we...
No, nothing to add on that.
Patrick?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm sorry to jump back a wee bit, but I did just want to follow up on a point that Adam Tompkins was raising, and Dr. Rennick was talking about the distinction between pre- and post-legislative referendums. Now, I entirely understand the point that you're making, but I wasn't quite clear where you thought that should lead us. Were you arguing that pre-legislative referendums are in principle bad practice and shouldn't happen, or that there should be some formal threshold for when a pre-legislative referendum requires a further confirmatory referendum? I'm obviously thinking in the Scottish context about the 97 devolution referendum, which was pre-legislative, but I don't think there was a general view that it was in any way flawed or illegitimate, simply on the basis that that was the way it happened.
Yeah. No, you're right on that. So what we have set out is that, and what the Independent Commission on Referendum set out in its report last year, is that if the government that is calling a pre-legislative referendum sets out in detail a white paper, as happened in 2014, as to what it expects to happen, and then it delivers upon that, and that's broadly speaking what happened in 1997 as well. There was a very clear plan, and then that was delivered. Then there's no need to have a further referendum. But if that is not delivered, then democracy requires a further referendum. If you think that the matter is sufficiently important that it requires the consent of the electorate as a whole, then that should be informed consent, and it should be consent informed by an understanding of what the proposal, the proposed change to the status quo actually is once that proposal has been worked up.
So the objection is to an undefined principle. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people would agree that the UK's current political situation stems from a mismatch between the simple proposition to leave and what was deliverable. But there are also those who would say, we didn't vote for a deal. They would say that they haven't been betrayed by no deal. It's a matter of interpretation whether their promise has been met. It seems difficult to codify that.
Yes, so what the Independent Commission proposed was that it would be for the Parliament that called the referendum to determine whether what had been agreed fitted the proposal that was set out before the referendum, because you can't have the courts deciding that. I mean, it's a fundamentally political question. So, I mean, this is an attempt to diffuse, well, in part it's an attempt to diffuse some of the very awkward politics that Westminster has got itself stuck into. More fundamentally, it's an attempt to ensure that there can be informed consent on these fundamentally important questions. But you're right that the messiness of politics is the messiness of politics, and you can't excise it entirely from the process.
Okay, thank you.
Just on that matter, Dr. Rennick, you say paragraph 42 of your evidence in terms of requiring a potential second referendum, the dangers could be greatly reduced if the Scottish Government produced a detailed plan for independence as it did ahead of the 2014 vote. I know we had that quickly discussed that earlier. Then you go on to say in the event of a vote for independence, and this is not obvious, this is not necessarily a bill about an independence referendum, obviously about referendums, although others might not agree with that statement. It would allow the government to claim a mandate for its plan both for the Scottish Parliament and negotiations with the UK. Do you want to just expand that a bit more? Just in terms of the question that...
Bearing in mind that not all Yes campaigners in 2014 supported the government's white paper.
No, that's a shock to me.
I mean, I'm very conscious of the fact that although we have formulated this proposal for double referendum requirements in general, and we developed this, including in discussion with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which adopted this proposal in its recommendations at the start of January of this year for referendums across the board. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm not thinking specifically about the Scottish independence referendum, but I'm very conscious that in any particular place, this is going to be thought about in the context of a particular referendum, and here that means the independence referendum. So I'm conscious that the political implications of this kind of proposal are likely to be of concern to members of the committee. And I just think it's important to make the point that although it might appear on the surface as though requiring a two-referendum process might make things harder for the side that wants change, for at least two reasons, I think that's not the case. And what you've pointed to there is the first reason. The standard argument against a two-referendum process is that it weakens the negotiating position of the people seeking change, because if the UK government knew that any proposal had to go to a second referendum, if it wasn't a very strong proposal, then it might try to give Scotland a bad deal, essentially, in the negotiations. Partly, I think that the mandate point here is a counter to that the Scottish Government has a mandate for its particular version of independence and for negotiating that particular version. I mean, in addition to that, I think we've just seen through the Brexit process that the idea that you can not have a democratic process at the end of a negotiation of something as fundamental as either Brexit or independence just doesn't hold up. You need to have some kind of democratic scrutiny process there, and therefore there is that danger that the other side will try to game the negotiations. So I think that argument against our proposal, I was just trying to counter that argument in that point. And then the second argument, which I made in the very final paragraphs of the evidence, is that if you have a two-referendum process, then you make it much more likely that there will be a majority for change at the first referendum, because people know that there's always a second chance to vote if they don't like what they get in the end. So I just wanted to make the point that it doesn't seem to me there's a clear implication in terms of who wins as a result of having a two-referendum process rather than a one-referendum process, but it does mean that you have a better democratic process.
Okay. Justin, do you want to say anything on that before Neil? I think you still want to come in this area. You're okay? Okay.
Just very briefly, I think Alan's proposal has a lot to commend it. And it's important to remember that as a country, and whether we're talking about the UK or Scotland or Wales or England, we are still feeling our way in terms of referendums. And up until 2016, we got lucky. 1975 was supposed to settle the issue of EEC membership. It manifestly failed. And so the idea of a second referendum to try and settle an issue on such an important constitutional issue such as independence or withdrawal from the European Union seems to me to be fundamentally sensible in a country that is not very experienced at running a referendum.
Okay, let's get back into some of the technical aspects. John, I think you had questions around spending.
Yeah, thanks very much. Professor Fisher, I think some of your comments were quite strong about the spending, and I think today, in fact, you've said that spending limits are virtually meaningless. I mean, you say in your evidence, you mentioned some of the figures, and I have to say I struggle to get my head around some of these. Designated lead campaigns, kind of 1.5 million, permitted participants, 150,000, non-registered campaigns, 10,000. Is it the relationship between these that is your main problem? Yes.
So, I mean, in a sense, all limits for the designated campaign are by definition arbitrary. But once you've settled on that figure, you then need to have a relative spend for the non-designated campaigns, just as we do for third-party spending in general elections.
Yeah. So you feel the general election system is working better than the referendum system?
Yes.
For spending, yes.
Yes, without question. I mean, the lesson of 2016 is that the 7 million spending limit for the designated campaigns was dwarfed by the actual amount of spending on each side.
Yes. And how are we going to fix that?
Well, well, there are two ways. You reduce the amount that permissible spending limit for the registered participants, that's non-designated, and you reduce significantly the spending for non-registered participants. The clear lesson from 2016 is that those who wish to exploit loopholes in the spending limits will do so.
Yes. I mean, I just wonder, having been involved, I was involved in a group as part of the Yes campaign in 2014, and one of the things that struck me was that salaries are not included, and I think that also appears in one of your papers. The whole question about, you know, if you contract out work, then you would have to include that. If you've got a staff member already, you don't include that. So actually, it seems to me that if there's a gap between the actual spend and the limit, maybe it's the actual spend that is artificially low in some cases.
I think the staff issue is an anomaly. It's the issue about the communication with voters through campaign materials, whether those be hard copy or digital. That's where the real abuse lies, and that's where we saw a significant problem in 2016. And if we could take the view that there should be no spending limits, and if we take that view, then of course all bets are off. But since for the last 20 years we've had a principle of spending limits at national level, and it seems to me that if we have those, we need to ensure that the designated campaign in a referendum or the candidate in a general election has primacy. We've had that principle for the candidate ever since the 1880s, and it was the case up until the early 90s that people who weren't candidates could only spend £5, and that was tested in the European Court and subsequently increased to £500. So that principle has existed for many, many years. What strikes me in referendums is that the relative maximum spend for non-designated is out of whack, and that's particularly acute in the Scottish case, where the non-registered campaign limit is the same for a UK referendum. So
despite the fact it's a smaller area.
Yeah,
yes.
despite the fact that the electorate is much smaller. Yes. So in relative terms, 10,000 to 1,500,000 is considerably more than 10,000 to 7 million.
Yes. I mean, how important is it? I mean, you say the spending on each side should be as equitable as possible, and I kind of get that in one sense, but on the other hand, I mean, am I right in saying that the Remain side spent a lot more than the Leave side, but the Leave side still won? So well, it doesn't quite go money and result.
No. I mean, but that's the amount you spend doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the campaign. You can spend vast sums of money on a terrible campaign. And indeed, the Remain campaign did precisely that, as did the Yes to AV campaign in 2011. So having the money doesn't mean you spend it properly. And you can't legislate for that. What you can legislate for is to say that there are upper limits on how much should be spent. And indeed, the referendum legislation goes further than the election referendum in trying to ensure equity by having an element of public funding to ensure that both sides are adequately funded. That does not exist for general elections.
And again, would you want that in the primary legislation or this area rather than in secondary legislation?
I think it would be sensible to legislate for it and then update it as and when required. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Wright, do you have anything to say on that?
No, Justin's very much the expert on this. The one point I would perhaps make is that, of course, the bill does not allow for public funding for designated campaigners in Scotland.
Yes, I think somebody else is coming on to public funding. Is that right?
Yeah, just dig down in the spending issue a bit more, because the Scottish context, from what I understand in 2014, was a bit different to the context we've just been hearing about in regard to what happened in the 16 referendum. Because if you look at the Electoral Commission figures for spending during the 14 referendum, we can see from the figures which I've got in front of me that both spent around 95% of the limit, where the combined spend of all other campaigners was less than half of this on the no side and around a quarter on the yes side. It's therefore not clear to me in the Scottish context what concern there is about a risk of a multiple non-registered campaigns challenging the primacy of a designated campaign is based on, because that's not, in terms of the reflection back on past practice here, that didn't happen.
You could take that view. I would counter that by saying that the cat is now out of the bag in terms of how you do get round this legislation. And that was very clearly demonstrated in the 2016 referendum. It may be that Scotland is different, but it may be that's an anomaly when comparing the two referendums. And it does seem to me that there could be any number of issues on which there is a referendum in Scotland and could attract the sort of behaviour that we saw in the 2016 referendum. So I think it would be folly not to learn from the difficulties that were experienced at UK level just a few years ago.
If you look at the figures for Scotland in terms of the Electoral Commission.
Only in terms of the number of non-registered participants.
But not in the detailed spending pattern?
No. My evidence is based on a large study I undertook for the Electoral Commission on how things worked for campaigners, and that seemed to me to be particularly pertinent.
Okay, John, did you have any questions?
Yeah, well, just a kind of minor point to finish off on the fact that under £200 people don't have to produce receipts for that. Is that a minor problem, or is that a major problem, would you say?
I think it's a minor problem. There's a real danger in over-regulating what is essentially a voluntary activity. And I think if you get into the business of having to declare very, very small receipts, you will drive people out of politics and increase the cost substantially, because you will need to spend much more on compliance. So there has to be a level set. It seems appropriate at £200.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Alex, Electoral Commission issues.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. The question is really around your views on the role of the Electoral Commission in relation to the question testing for referendums, and particularly Dr. Rennick's point in his submission that question testing should take place even when a question has been previously tested or proposed by the Commission.
Yes, I think absolutely the process should always be applied, irrespective of whether the question has been tested before. And as I pointed out, and several others pointed out in evidence, written evidence to the committee, preceding the Brexit referendum, the Electoral Commission looked at that twice, and because there was a private member's bill previously, and on the second time round it produced stronger recommendations leading to a change in the question. I think it's clear that circumstances change, and therefore the degree to which a question meets the intelligibility test may also change, and that fundamentally has to be allowed for. And going back to some of the comments that we've both made earlier, the only reasons, as far as I can see, for not, the only impartial reason that I can see for not having the Electoral Commission testing questions would be to speed things up, because it takes 10 to 12 weeks to do that. But speeding things up is not a virtue in referendums. So I don't think that's a good reason for doing it.
I mean, I would agree completely with Alan here, and it's pertinent to note that polling companies constantly review their questions because they very rapidly go out of date in respect to people's understanding of what those questions mean. And it seems to me that on something as important as a referendum, given that they are not taking place regularly, given that they are one-off events, I think it would be sensible to question test on every occasion.
Thank you very much. Very clear. Thank you.
James.
Just following up on that, earlier in the session, Professor Fisher, you said it was important to get agreement around the questions, and aside from the importance of there being a robust process, do you agree that in terms of the way Clause 7 is worded and the way the Electoral Commission is excluded if the questions have already been used in a previous referendum, that potentially could undermine confidence in the questions that have been used if there's not broad agreement and consensus for them?
Well, I'd go back to my previous response. I think excluding the Electoral Commission from the process at all is inadvisable. So I wouldn't recommend that at all. Yeah. It may well reduce confidence. That would be pure speculation. But in terms of whether or not the question remains fit for purpose, it seems to me to be a leap of faith to say that if it worked last time, it must work this time. Would there be a time limit between the referendums when that sort of decision would be made? It seems to me to be a little loose with the arrangements to exclude what's a very important part of the referendum process.
Okay. Anybody else in that area? Gordon, Purda.
Thanks very much, Convener. Alan, in your written evidence, you suggested that the 28-day Purda period be changed to cover the whole of the national campaign period, although certain announcements would continue during that. Currently, the 28-day rule on Purda is clear and understood by most voters. Would this change create confusion?
No. Why do you think it might create confusion?
Because you've got a cut-off point at the moment where, in theory, nothing should be published by the government within that 28-day period. You're suggesting, I think, what you referred to as a long and thin model, where some announcements could continue during the whole referenda period.
So yes, so there still should be a cut-off point. It's just it should cover the whole of the referendum period. So at the moment, I mean, if we look, for example, at the 2016 referendum, that 28-day period was the final 4 weeks of the campaign, clearly, but the referendum period had been a 10-week period, and there was much active campaigning going on during those first 6 weeks. And it just makes no sense at all that there should be different periods for these different things, and that creates confusion. Having different periods. I mean, we have the situation where a regulated campaigner would incur expenses for making a claim, but the government can do it, and that is not regulated at all during that period, the initial period of the campaign, and that just makes no sense at all, I think. So whatever the actual referendum period is, should be the period to which the restriction on publications by governments should apply.
And if it covered the whole period, I mean, what impact would that have on government's normal day-to-day business?
Yeah. So if the scope of the provision were unchanged, then the danger is, particularly on a very broad topic such as independence or Brexit, that it would impinge upon government's normal business, which is why you don't just need to lengthen the period, you also need to narrow the scope so that it covers only communications that promote a particular outcome in the referendum. And I know the Electoral Commission has been working up detailed proposals on exactly how you would do this. I mean, I think essentially you would base it on what are the sorts of communication that count towards expenses for registered campaigners. But the Electoral Commission has been working up the detail of exactly how you would define that scope.
Okay. And given that the existing 2000 Act would still apply across the rest of the UK when this bill goes through, how would the UK government abide by that if they had an interest in referenda that was taking place in Scotland?
Well, if it was a referendum subject to Section 30 orders, then presumably you would have something similar to the Edinburgh Agreement in terms of getting that agreed between the governments. If it's not subject to Section 30 order and the UK government is interfering in things, I haven't thought that one through, I have to confess, but that would create difficulties, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's why I'm asking the question, because clearly it would create difficulties and it would create an uneven playing field for both governments. So, I mean, is there any way we can resolve this? I mean, surely the easiest way to resolve it is just to replicate what currently exists in the 2000 Act.
Well, I think the danger is that is allowing the tail to wag the dog. I mean, if it's not a referendum that's subject to Section 30 order, it's not obvious now why the UK government would be intervening. I agree with you that there's potential difficulty here, but what this bill should be trying to do is regulate referendums in Scotland as well as possible. And I think the current provisions regarding publications by governments are just not working, and manifestly did not work in 2016, and shouldn't be allowed to stand. I mean, obviously I'm arguing, the Electoral Commission is arguing, many people are arguing that PIPERA should be changed as well.
Has there been any suggestions from the UK government that they're going to be looking at the 2000 Act?
They have indicated that they're looking at aspects of the 2000 Act, particularly in regard to digital campaigning. And I know there are many people in the UK Parliament who think that this kind of provision needs to be included in that review. What the current UK government thinks, I couldn't comment on.
Okay, Professor.
I must admit, I've never been entirely comfortable with the idea of excluding government from the referendum process. So the legislation in PIPERA was introduced largely because of a member of the then Neil Committee's concerns about the conduct of the 1975 referendum. And it does seem to me, in one sense, slightly perverse that a government who wishes to propose a referendum should therefore not be able to have any say in it. It's also worth saying that in the 2016 referendum, the government complied entirely with the law in terms of distributing the booklet, although I think I was the only person in the UK who didn't receive one. But it still meant that there was a great deal of controversy about that. Now, the period under which governments can make any claims is set, and by definition, of course, that's also slightly arbitrary. Wherever you put that time point, government will push up against it. Of course, it has an interest in the outcome. And I think there is a significant regulatory challenge, and you outlined very clearly the one about a UK government intervening in a Scottish referendum, although politically it would seem to be very unwise to do so. I think it's an extraordinarily difficult area upon which to legislate, and I would be cautious about excluding government from certain areas of business during a referendum campaign for what is actually quite a substantial period of time. So I don't have a neat answer to your question, but I also think it does raise issues where I think we should be careful what we wish for.
Okay, thanks very much.
Patrick, you had questions on the national database, is that right?
Yes, thank you. I think both of your papers talked about establishing a national database to make it easier for campaign organisations, and particularly smaller campaign organisations that are less well resourced, to do checking on the admissibility of donors or the permissibility of donors. I'm wondering whether there are alternative ways that you might have thought about of achieving that objective, of removing that barrier for campaign organisations, and whether you considered any possible unintended consequences of the database approach, either practical consequences in terms of a possible mismatch between who's on the national database and who's on the locally held electoral register, or political consequences. You know, we've seen over the last decade or so 2 or 3 attempts to establish national databases for one purpose or another. Most recently, 2 years ago, the Scottish Government abandoned the proposal to turn the NHS Central Register into a national database. Whether there are legitimate concerns or illegitimate concerns, there are real problems of perception about how national databases potentially change the relationship between citizen and the state. And given that trust is really, really important in a democratic exercise, is there a danger that this kind of proposal is interpreted in a way that changes people's level of trust in the system?
There is a danger of that. Yes, I would accept that. I think at a minimum, you could ensure that all local authorities kept data in the same format to enable the merging of those data. So we're not talking about holding dual databases. Yeah. We're talking about a system whereby a newly established referendum campaign is not required to go round to every single local authority in the country in which the referendum is being held.
Would that be reasonably easily achieved, having local authorities use the same format?
Well, it would mark a fundamental shift from local authorities effectively doing what they like and the Electoral Commission having control or running elections more centrally. Yeah. It does require a shift. There has been some resistance to that. Quite why there is the resistance is beyond me. It doesn't seem to me unreasonable to insist, even if these registers are kept at local authority level, that they're not all in the same format, right, because they are so critical to the compliance in terms of donations. Yeah. So, of course, the local authority registration existed before we had the compliance requirements introduced by PIPERA in respect of donations, and it seems to me that one piece of legislation has not kept up with the other.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add?
No.
Okay. Just related, this notion of compliance, checking the acceptability of donations. We have more recently had, I think, allegations that were raised about the Brexit Party and the way that it was raising funds from smaller donations below a threshold, and whether those might be coming from overseas donors or what have you. Is there a case for us going further on questioning which donations a campaign body has to take responsibility for checking where they're coming from and reporting that?
Well, that's a question of threshold. I mean, the essential principle is that donations should be made by persons registered to vote in the United Kingdom. At present, there is a threshold which means that not all donations need to be checked. In the light of the accusations in respect of one particular party, there may be a case for lowering that threshold, but I go back to the point I made earlier in respect of receipts. There is a balance to be struck between effective regulation and over-regulation, and I think that would be something that would need to be discussed between all of the parties.
Okay, thank you.
I think you had another point you wanted to raise.
Just one additional question, Convener. It's just on the issue of digital imprints. I mean, one of the big changes in campaigning in recent years has been the use of technology, particularly social media, and you know that can give, in a referendum, in any campaign, that can give rise as to how that is controlled and regulated and how spending is monitored. Are there any experiences from referendums internationally that we can look at in terms of digital imprints and digital campaigning, which could be used to strengthen any of the provisions in the current proposed legislation?
So certainly digital imprints are, I think I'm right in saying they're required in New Zealand. And there have been some difficulties in New Zealand around working out exactly where to apply the rules and where not. So there's the issue that I raised in my evidence, the Electoral Commission I think raised in their evidence as well, around you don't want to be capturing individuals who are just expressing their views on Twitter. And there have been some difficulties around that area in New Zealand. So it's clearly a point that needs to be thought about quite carefully. And the bill as it stands, so Scotland of course was the first part of the UK to introduce regulation requiring digital imprints for the 2014 referendum. That provision was widely welcomed, but the Electoral Commission concluded afterwards that there had been some problems with a lack of clarity as to where the threshold should be applied. The bill proposes a slight addition to the wording of the provision relative to that in the 2013 Act, but it still doesn't really address this issue. It still doesn't make it clear that someone just expressing a personal view and not being paid for it does not have to provide an imprint. And I think that needs to be clarified in the bill.
I think, as Alan says, the need for digital imprints is quite clear, although I would demur from the DCMS statement that the legislation is therefore not fit for purpose. So all the empirical evidence at this stage is that the actual electoral impact of digital campaigning is somewhat overstated. Now that's likely to change as other campaign methods have become more important themselves. It is, as Alan says, it's very difficult to capture things like organised Twitter campaigns, but actually I don't think legislation should seek to do that, because in many ways it's no different from simply trying to regulate ordinary conversational campaigns. And there comes a point where you have to say, if this is an advertisement, it should have an imprint. But there are some things that you simply cannot regulate. You couldn't regulate people chatting in a pub, nor can you regulate people expressing a view on Twitter, even if collectively they do a lot of it. So it seems to me that we should have digital imprints, not necessarily because there's a desperate need now, but because there will be a significant need in the future. But always remember that you cannot regulate every aspect of a referendum or an election.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I'm a little bit uneasy with the distinction that you've made there between formal advertising and online conversation, because surely the change that social media brings about is the ability for organised, funded campaign organisations to capture conversation, to capture online social media conversation, and to use it as the platform for their organisation's message. Surely we need to think about a way of achieving the regulatory effect in that space, rather than...
How would you do it? I mean, how is that? In one sense, it is no different from a group of Liberal Democrat Party members all meeting in a pub, chatting with people, and saying, "Yeah, the Lib Dem view on this is X." Having a public meeting. It just seems to me to be something that goes beyond what one could reasonably regulate. You might say, for example, okay, any Twitter account that is an official one for Labour or the Conservatives, whatever, should be subject to that. Well, it has the digital imprint. It says Labour and the Conservatives on it. And what's to stop people then using a kind of fake account?
But if social media is being used in this way, for example, to use some recent examples, to massively boost an organisation's false claim about Turkey's EU membership, or about the impact of EU membership on the ability to protect polar bears. You know, some claims which were very clearly organisationally derived. They were campaign messages from an organisation, and simply being boosted through social media in a way that made those claims unaccountable.
I understand the dilemma, but I'm not sure how different it is from all of us spreading disinformation through everyday conversation with our colleagues. It's a question of scale rather than principle.
If it's a question of scale, would it be reasonable to suggest that social media accounts with a sufficient reach, that the threshold for regulation should be the reach of a social media account in terms of the way it's regulated, rather than whether it's social media or paid media?
Well, the reason we have imprints is, and those imprints originally have been on campaign materials, is so that we can track the spending and audit the spending. And if an organisation takes out an ad on Facebook or Twitter, there is the case for the digital imprint to match the spending. But the Labour Party, the SNP, whoever, engaging in a Twitter conversation is cost-free.
I accept that the financial accountability is one aspect, but isn't it also necessary in order to achieve accountability for telling the truth? Knowing who a message is coming from allows you to judge whether an organisation is being honest in its campaigning.
I think you're equating official campaigns with truth-telling. I'm not.
Well,
I mean,
no, I'm saying that they're not always the same. That's the problem.
I mean, I recognise the issue. I think there is a danger of us going down a road that we try and regulate anything that moves, and there is a point at which effective regulation can become ineffective regulation if the people propagating or pushing social media are getting round the legislation. What we wouldn't want to do is create the equivalent of the Dangerous Dogs Act. And there is a real risk of regulation falling into disrepute if it tries to cover everything but ends up doing something very, very badly.
I appreciate it's difficult. I think it needs more thought.
But I think a lot of that thought is happening. So the Electoral Commission is working on that, on this very hard. I know the UK Cabinet Office has been thinking about this. You know, they said under the previous administration that they would be bringing forward proposals on how to do digital imprints later this year. So there is quite a lot of thinking happening. I think, you know, you're both right to identify the problems on both sides of this. It is a really difficult issue, but it seems to me that we don't have enough transparency at the moment. There is a lot of campaigning going on that is opaque.
Yeah.
And I think we don't have the balance right at the moment. But exactly how to shift it, I think, is a really, really difficult question that does require engagement with those organisations.
A couple of questions, just for completeness, for record purposes, just to make sure we cover all the ground that we have. The Electoral Commission point out that the bill does not require campaigners to give details about what they spend money on, or when, where and how they spend it. They recommend amending the bill so that campaigners would be required to include this information on their spending returns on the basis this is proportionate and does not impose a reasonable burden. Is that a reasonable suggestion, and is there any international perspective on this?
So I think it's certainly a reasonable suggestion. I think the UK is actually goes further than most countries in the degree to which spending is already regulated in referendums. So the UK is already doing better than most, but still not well enough, I would say, in this area. And the Electoral Commission's recommendations here have been developed over many years, and you know, I think they're very well thought out, and I would take them very seriously.
I don't think they're unreasonable suggestions at all, given that those data will already have been collected by the organisations. Every organisation will have a sense of when it spent the money. So, no, I don't have any objection to it at all.
And one final question, again on the Electoral Commission, because they also raise concerns about allowing those campaigns spending over £250,000 up to 6 months to provide an auditor's report, and point out once they have carried out compliance checks, the information would not be publicly available until around 9 months after polling day. Their view is that the information needs to be available to voters as soon as possible after a referendum, while it's still a live issue. So what's your view on that?
There's always an issue about when information is published, and the question of the live issue is very, very important. For a referendum, however, it's rather difficult because there will be no subsequent referendum unless Alan's very sensible proposals are introduced. I can see why there would be an argument for lessening the period. How long that should be, I have no firm view on. Okay. But I think we need to recognise that in a referendum, once the vote is cast, the point at which there is some moral outrage may be 9 months or 2 months, but it's not going to change the outcome of the referendum unless there was an illegal act.
The horse is bolted.
No.
The horse is bolted.
Quite.
The Independent Commission on Referendums took evidence on this and came to the conclusion that 3 months would be a reasonable cut-off date.
Okay.
I think it's worth adding to this that, of course, the organisations may cease to function 9 months after the referendum, so it would be sensible so that they don't incur further cost unnecessarily to have a shorter time period.
Okay, Alex, you got a follow-up on that?
No, so I had a brief question on thresholds.
Oh, sorry, on you go.
Just a brief question on thresholds, which hasn't really been touched much in any of the submissions. There's a petition in front of Parliament suggesting that a 2/3 majority should be required for constitutional change, as is the norm for many organisations, from sports clubs to political parties. I just wondered if you had any views on the matter.
I think that would be a very bad idea. I think to have a majority voting for a proposition and then being told, sorry, that actually just doesn't have any standing, inflames passions and does no good to the subsequent political processes. There are very, very few countries that have supermajority requirements on referendums. In fact, the only referendums that I'm aware of have been in Canadian provinces that have had supermajority requirements. Quite a few places have turnout thresholds, or what we call electorate thresholds, so the type of threshold that was used in Scotland in 1979. Turnout thresholds are clearly undesirable because they encourage those who are in danger of losing to suppress turnout in order to invalidate the vote. So a turnout threshold is clearly a bad idea. Electorate thresholds, where you say 40% of the electorate have to vote for the proposal, don't have such clear theoretical problems, but in Scotland it seems to me that they're pretty discredited from the 1979 experience, so you'd be a brave politician to recommend introducing one of those in Scotland, I would think. And generally my view is that, as I've indicated earlier, a referendum should be a part of a multi-stage decision-making process. It shouldn't be a one-stop way of getting to a decision on a major issue, and therefore the safeguards should be in the rest of the process, not in any super wacky threshold on the referendum vote itself. So having proper parliamentary scrutiny, having some kind of citizens' assembly process, having these kinds of things in the process, that ensures that you have a good democratic process. But then if the majority wants the change at the end of that detailed process, then that's the democratic decision.
I wouldn't put it quite as forcibly, and I can see the case for a supermajority for a fundamental constitutional change. However, I think that the dual referendum proposal that Alan puts forward is a better safeguard and one that's more defensible. Of course, if people know the rules beforehand, then a supermajority is arguably defendable. But I think, on balance, the dual process is a better one.
Thank you.
Okay, that's been quite well, it's been more than a useful session. It's been quite a long session. I'm very grateful for the witnesses coming along and providing that evidence. And we moved from super processes to super wacky processes, which is now a new part of our lexicon as far as the committee's report is concerned. But I want to thank our witnesses for coming along today, giving us that evidence. It was very helpful. And I now suspend the meeting briefly before we move to the next panel. Thank you. Okay, I welcome our second panel this morning. Can I welcome Michael Clancy, who's the Director of the Law Reform Law Society of Scotland, and Jess Sargent, who's a researcher at the Institute of Government. Thank you both very much for your written submissions. They were very helpful. But I think we'll just get straight into questions. Angela Constance.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. You've obviously heard the earlier evidence session, so I want to start by really just asking a general question about your overall assessment of the bill. There appears to be a theme in all the evidence that we've received that the bill is based on previous good practice, but actually in some areas could be a wee bit more forward looking to the future. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to agree, disagree or add your own comments to that.
So, I would agree with that general assessment. I think the purpose of having a bill, I think, is a very good one. Scotland at the moment doesn't have any standing referendum regulation for future referendums. It was applied ad hoc for the 2014 referendum, and so I think it's really important to have that standing legislation so that the rules are known in advance and aren't applied particularly for each different referendum. As you mentioned, it's based on the UK's regulatory framework, which was introduced in 2000. So obviously there is some updating that needs to be done. And the bill incorporates a lot of those updates that have been applied to UK referendums since 2000. So it incorporates all those changes that have happened before, which I think is a really positive thing. I think there is some scope for updating it further, although, as the panel previously mentioned, a lot of those legislative solutions to regulating the new types of campaigning we find aren't quite obvious yet. And so I think one thing perhaps to say is that unlike PPERA, the UK's regulatory framework, which has gone unamended since 2000, I think the Scottish bill needs to become a kind of living bill, and that opportunities to amend it when there are those legislative solutions need to be available. In terms of, as we said in our submission, our main concerns with the bill are about the regulation-making power and the fact that the referendum question and the referendum period would be specified in subordinate legislation rather than primary legislation. Although there might be reasons for doing so, it's very important that any future referendum is able to command maximum legitimacy, and the result is to command maximum legitimacy. And therefore, there should be maximum scrutiny of that referendum proposal. And so we propose that that should be in primary rather than secondary legislation.
Okay, and Mr. Glancy?
Yes, I think you can be confident that we share much of those views. As we said in our memorandum, we think that having a bill is a good idea. I think we said that the policy objectives set by the government would be met by the bill, and that we agree that the provision of a particular legal framework for referendums to be legislated in a consistent and timely manner is a good one. But there are concerns around about the regulation-making powers, about the powers of the Electoral Commission, and also we think that with a view to the future, there could be some learning taken from what has transpired over the European referendum, and in particular drawing on the views of the Electoral Commission, the information officers and the Office of the Information Commissioner, and also some of the investigations being made by Westminster committees.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I was interested in Ms Sargent's comment about how you make it a more living bill. Obviously, when legislation is passed, there are some opportunities to amend. That tends to be through regulation-making powers, but I wondered if you had any other thoughts about how you keep your standing legislation up to best practice.
I mean, it's difficult because quite often that does require legislative time, and that's one of the reasons why we've seen the UK framework hasn't necessarily kept up in that way, because they haven't been prepared to give over time to amend it. So the bill does contain a regulation-making power for the ministers to update regulation on the basis of Electoral Commission recommendations. That is the way that the Scottish Government has tried to approach that problem of being able to update the legislation. But as we see in Westminster, where referendums usually require primary legislation, that's another opportunity. So if the regulation-making powers were taken out of the bill and you had the opportunity to pass primary legislation to set the question and the referendum period every time there was a referendum, then that would provide some kind of legislative vehicle in which to make updates.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Glancy.
No, it's all right. It's okay. And I think as a coda to that, of course, the power to modify in Section 37, it does have provisions where Scottish ministers can make regulations in consequence of or in connection with any modifications bracket or proposed modifications of any other enactment relating to the conduct of referendums, elections and entitlement to vote. So clearly there's a bit of attempt at future-proofing, but as we heard earlier this morning about concerns regarding the phraseology or proposed modification, I think that does stretch future-proofing to also not just what has happened, but also what is perceived or imagined to happen at some point. And I think there's an amber light to be placed here in terms of proceeding with caution, but that is supplemented, of course, by giving effect to recommendations of the Electoral Commission, as Jess has mentioned. You flip then to Section 2, which allows regulations under the Act to make incidental, supplementary, consequential, transitional, and all the other usual elements of modification, and to modify any enactment. And we highlight in our evidence that this does not specify this bill, but any enactment would include this once it is enacted. So therefore there are two provisions which look to potential modification of this legislation.
Okay, I mean, some of my other colleagues will come to the issue about how you balance the ability to future-proof legislation and, you know, the appropriate role of Parliament. But if I could just return your attention to our earlier discussion around timings. So there's variation of practice when we look at what's went before us in terms of timings between the legislation passing and polling day, and then there's been variation of practice in terms of the actual referendum period, and there's been some discussion about whether you should or could vary the length of the referendum period depending on what the actual referendum's about. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on the issues of timings and you know, the pros and cons around minimum and maximum periods for the control part of the campaign.
Yeah, so the bill as it stands, as we highlight in our evidence, doesn't have a minimum specified period between the designation of referendum campaigners and polling day, which we highlight that to be a problem. It means that it could be incredibly short and that campaigners won't have, the lead designated campaigners won't be able to use their entitlements, such as a higher spending limit, for very long, and that would have massive impacts on the ability of the campaigners to make their case and also public debate about the issue. So certainly I think that's something in the bill that needs to be rectified. I think the Electoral Commission recommends that there should be a minimum stated somewhere there of 10 weeks. So I think that's with the bill, that's my primary issue. In terms of the...
Sorry, forgive me, what's your view about a minimum period in terms of, you know, should it be 4 weeks, 10 weeks?
I would personally, I would agree with I would take the Electoral Commission's advice that there is a minimum of 10 weeks between that period, which has been practiced for most UK referendums as well. As you mentioned, there have been some that have been longer, but I think 10 weeks minimum is a good period of time. In terms of the time between the legislation passing and polling day, I think referendums are something that shouldn't be rushed. Again, the Electoral Commission recommends there should be at least, the legislation should be clear at least 6 months before it's due to be complied with. So that would be if the legislation relates to the regulation of campaigners or the designation process, then that would be before the designation process even begins. So that would be maybe I think about 9 months before the referendum. I don't think there's a magic number that you can state. I would certainly be keen. The Electoral Commission have a lot of experience of running referendums, and I would be keen to listen to their recommendations. But certainly, yeah, I think the point to make again is that referendums have huge potential to change, the course of the future of the country, as we're seeing right now, and so a maximum time as possible should be given to make sure that they're run correctly.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Clancy, do you have anything to add?
We made no particular comment about referendum periods in our submission. I would leave it to the experts.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Just one small point. On the minimum period of at least 6 months between the referendum legislation and coming into force and being implemented, I did ask this to the first panel. Of course, there'll be a distinction between the framework legislation, which is being discussed right now, which produces all the rules, regulations, etc., spending all the technical aspects of it in place. And if the government is right, and it's up to this committee in terms of that process, that bill is to be in place by the end of the year, and say whatever type of referendum was, in 9 months' time after that, a year after that, does that legislation itself, in terms of the framework, provide enough of the bedrock for that 6 months rule in terms of a process for the future?
I mean, certainly part of the reason for the Electoral Commission's recommendation is so that people who are required to regulate campaigners or to hold the poll, they are aware of the legislation that they're required to comply with. But there is also another element in terms of public debate, public discourse. In a way, the public needs some time to prepare for a referendum. Campaign groups need some time to decide whether they might want to apply for designation of lead campaigners to help organise, to ensure that you have the best debate you possibly can. So I think that would certainly answer some of the reasons for the Electoral Commission's recommendation, but I think there's also a case for a long period of time between the proposal for a referendum being decided and polling day.
Under the bill as is currently envisaged, that referendum could be made available by regulations, which are affirmative procedure. So we're talking about 40 days. That seems to be quite a short period of time for the idea to be out there. So I think that we've got to be very careful to make sure that there is sufficient time for people to become acquainted. And as Jess has indicated, the Electoral Commission has views on that, which we would not demur from.
Okay, and that takes us neatly, I think, into Adam's question. Yeah.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I want to ask about Section 1 of the bill to start with, the power that Section 1 of the bill would confer, if enacted, on Scottish ministers to provide for referendums in Scotland by regulations. What are your views about that power?
We've taken the view that this is, as it is currently framed, an inappropriate way to proceed. We indicate in our commentary on Section 1, combining it with Section 3, there's a measure of crossover between these, that legislation setting the date for the questions, the date for the referendum and the question or questions to be asked in that, it should take the form of an act, or at the very least, and very much as a suboptimal position, a Scottish statutory instrument subject to superaffirmative procedure. And by superaffirmative procedure, because that phraseology is bandied about, just put it on the record, the Scottish Parliament's provisions for superaffirmative mean that there has to be pre-legislative scrutiny on the draft, a formal consultation on the draft order, and then approval in the chamber. So it is an issue which crops up occasionally, and one of the things which was mentioned this morning about subordinate legislation not being of sufficient stature for great questions regarding a country is one thing which we can debate about back and forth. That statutory instruments cannot be amended is a significant feature here, which is also why we draw attention to the fact that there are provisions in legislation where statutory instruments can be amended, namely the Census Act of 1920 and the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004. The provisions for amending have to be built into the bill, which allows for such regulations to be made. Again, if the committee were to choose to go to a super affirmative basis, we would strongly recommend that the capacity for amendments to be taken to that subordinate legislation as it's passing through should be followed.
Thank you.
I would agree with most of what Michael said, and certainly in our evidence we propose that that any referendum question should be in primary rather than secondary legislation. Partially that's so it can go through the full scrutiny process of legislation rather than secondary legislation, which is slightly less rigorous, but also because if the statutory instrument is unamendable, as Michael mentioned, that it conflates the question of whether there should be a referendum with what the question for the referendum should be. And the Electoral Commission will comment on the intelligibility of the referendum, although there is a slight exception for questions that are tested before, which I imagine we'll talk about later. But yeah, the Electoral Commission will comment on the intelligibility of the referendum question, but they won't comment on whether it's the right question that people should be asking. That job should be for the Parliament. And approving that question through statutory instrument doesn't give the Parliament the opportunity to look at that. MSPs might have to choose between passing a question that they think is suboptimal because they want to hold a referendum, or not having a referendum at all.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Just to be absolutely clear, though, the IFG's view is not that Section 1 of the bill should be amended so that we use super affirmative procedures, which is a suggestion put by the Law Society of Scotland. The IFG's view is that Section 1 of the bill should be removed so that future referendums require primary legislation. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Anybody else in that area? No. Okay, we then move on to John, spending.
Okay, thanks, Convener. You may have heard my questions to the previous panel that we had, and I just wonder if you would share their concerns about the whole area of spending limits, as I mentioned before, the fact that we have these, what I think a lot of people don't understand the terms, designated lead campaigns who are allowed to spend £1.5 million, permitted participants, 150,000, non-registered campaigns, 10,000, and so on. Is that an area that concerns you, and should we be doing something about it?
Personally, it's not something we've looked into in detail. I know Justin has, so there's some. I would suggest that from their advice and the Electoral Commission, other people that have had experience of that.
And I suppose we are in the same position. What we do highlight in our submission is that the Venice Commission Code of Good Practice on Referendum states that funding should be transparent, particularly when it comes to campaign accounts. And again, there are experts in this field, from one of whom we heard this morning, but there are experts in this field who are better placed to be able to detail precisely what the figures should be and what the kind of positioning and relative quotient should work out to be.
Okay, thanks very much. Ms Sargent, you do comment, however, on the idea of public funding. So I wanted to ask you about that. Well, maybe you could just explain to us why you think public funding might be required, because, I mean, it does appear both the European, Scottish, previous referendums we've had, referenda, that there was sufficient money raised on both sides, so there would not be a need for public funding?
I mean, you're right. Certainly in the Scottish independence referendum and the EU referendum, they were able to raise sufficient funds, although the UK regulatory framework does make provision for public funding for referendum campaigns. So the designated campaigns did receive that. I think the point I wanted to make was that although inevitably, this bill is being talked about in the context of possible referendums that might happen in the short term. This referendums bill would cover any referendum that might be held in the future in Scotland. And it might be the case that those referendums don't attract such high levels of donations as perhaps, say, an independence referendum would be. And that would be particularly problematic if a lot of groups, for example, business groups or political parties, were all allied to one side of the referendum, in which case the other side might struggle to raise funds and put its case to the public.
I mean, was that not the case with the European one, that actually most of business and unions and things were on the one side?
I mean, that's perhaps I'm not saying it's inevitable in all circumstances, and actually the reason why the UK framework contains provision for public funding is going back to when the Committee on Standards of Public Life was first asked to look at this back in 1999. And they drew experience from the Welsh referendum in 1997, where one side struggled to attract significant funding, and they felt, and campaigners felt, and the public felt, that had a real impact on debate, in that people weren't able to hear both sides of the argument and to really consider it. And as we know, that referendum had quite a low turnout, which perhaps is a reflection of the question and the demand for that referendum, but also I do think it is in part a question of the quality of debate around that. And we don't make a firm recommendation that, yes, we should definitely have public funding or not. That's obviously for Scotland to decide. And I note that the decision not to have public funding for the 2014 referendum was because of a consultation the Scottish Government undertook that found that wasn't something that the public wanted. But I think we need to bear in mind that this referendums bill would cover all future referendums, and perhaps you might want to think about providing for that eventuality.
Yeah, I mean, I do see that argument. I just wonder, I mean, there's a kind of public lack of confidence in politics, I fear. And, you know, even the other week I was at a by-election and people were questioning if any of my expenses were covered from taxpayers' money. And obviously they didn't want it to be, and I was able to say, no, all of that money is donated by me, basically. So I just wonder if the downside would be, you know, this kind of public negative reaction that their taxpayers' money is going into a political campaign, be it a party or a campaign.
I can totally understand that argument, and that is the risk with a policy, with a proposal such as public funding for referendum campaigns. But that does need to be balanced against the potential for having a poor quality of debate in future referendums. Like I say, we don't come to a firm view, but I think it's something that it's one of the notable differences between this bill and the UK regulatory framework, and I think it's worth commenting on and thinking about.
So would the kind of compromise position be that you would assume normally that you wouldn't put in public money, but if it became apparent that one side, you know, just was not able to put its argument, that would become the kind of exception or the fallback position?
Yeah, I mean, that is one possible approach. The slight difficulty with that approach is that whose decision is it, whether that funding is allocated or not, and could that be perceived to have a political purpose in that decision? So it is difficult. I'm not proposing to come down one side firmly or the other, but yeah, it's worth talking about.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
James, digital imprints.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Convener. One of the big changes in campaigning in recent years has been the growth of online campaigning, and the bill makes provision for digital imprints to be used where there's appropriate online campaigning. This is I think it's a challenging area in terms of being able to understand what requires a digital imprint and also to monitor it properly. And it's important that it doesn't get out of control. What do you see as appropriate online uses that need digital imprints assigned to them in a referendum?
And at risk of repeating some of what was said before, I think there is a distinction to be made between paid political advertising and organic advertising. I think it's clear to me that if online advertising has been paid for, as is parallel for published advertising that's been paid for, then that should definitely contain an imprint. I think organic, so peer-to-peer, shared on social media, shouldn't require an imprint, as the Electoral Commission said there's still some thought to be given in this area, and there are difficult trade-offs to be made about the regulatory burden. But I think, compared to the, as was mentioned, the Scottish 2014 referendum was the first referendum in which imprints were applied on digital materials, and so as many lessons that can be learnt from that certainly should be.
We highlight in our submission the report of the UK Parliament's Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee on online harms. And in that report, the committee make various recommendations to the UK government, which have not so far been taken up, about making sure that a category should be introduced relating to digital spending on campaigns, and information about all political advertising material should be searchable in public. I think we also heard evidence this morning about the government, the UK government, having indicated that it would bring forward a technical proposal for a regime on digital imprints later this year. And I think this is something which is clearly gathering ahead of steam, and we recommend to the Scottish Government that they take this into account.
You interested in database issues?
Thank you. Good morning. I think you were both in the room when we were discussing this with the previous panel, so I'll just very quickly remind you that the concerns that I had with the idea of a national database were partly practical. Is there a danger that there could be a mismatch between a national database and the locally held register? Could there be any practical consequences from that? And partly political. What risk would we be running in relation to the perception of democracy by creating a national database, given the concerns and controversies that have arisen since the National ID database, the NHS Central Register, proposals from the Scottish Government, the National Entitlement Card? Some of these schemes have been very controversial. Would this one risk running into the same kind of issues of perception?
Inevitably, there will be people who will contest any change in this kind of area, and particularly if it touches on the exposure of details about individuals. And I think the important thing is that we've got, at the moment, we're just talking in theory and without any concrete proposal. So if one were to say anything to those who are going to create concrete proposals, it would be make sure that a proper balance is set between protecting data and at the same time allowing scrutiny and accountability. Beyond that, it's quite difficult to say very much more.
Presumably the concern about the objective of enabling campaign organisations to check the permissibility of donations is one that we all would share. Would either of you have suggestions about other ways of achieving that objective that wouldn't necessarily go down the route of a national database? Is that something you've looked at?
Unfortunately, it's not something we've particularly looked at, so I'll defer to the experts on this one.
Not to worry. Thank you.
Alex, Electoral Commission stuff?
About the role of the Electoral Commission in relation to question testing for referendums. Both the Law Society's expressed concerns and the IFG similarly. The IFG also more specifically talked about where there's only one circumstance in which the exemption would apply, where the 2014 independence referendum question. And this would seem completely unnecessary, given the bill's only meant to cover devolved issues. So I just wonder if you'd like to elaborate a little bit on your views on this section.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, question testing by the Electoral Commission comes with a cost and it comes with a time implication, but it's considered to be one of the most rigorous processes of question testing in the world. And I think what we can say from all previous referendums is, while people might have problems with the reason for the question being asked or such like, I think people are everyone has faith that that question they were asking is not biased, it was fair, and there's consent on both sides for that. like I say, there may be reasons such as timing or cost why not to test it again, but I think personally that they're trumped by the kind of the testing and the legitimacy aspect of it. And there's no reason why a question tested before can't be further improved. Certainly, there might be more experience of that particular question or that particular debate, which might mean that new issues come to light. There's also, it's important to test questions in the current context. Things might have changed. And so question testing takes around 12 weeks, and relative to the cost of a whole referendum is really quite marginal. And I think the reasons for exempting certain questions are not strong enough to justify the inclusion of that exemption.
And we criticised section 3.7, which provides that section would not apply, that is, involvement of the Electoral Commission in relation to a question or statement if the Electoral Commission have previously published a report setting out their views as to the intelligibility of the question or statement, or recommended the wording of the question or statement. And again, it's a question of context. Is a question set once a question set forever? Are there changes in conditions which have occurred? We think that a question should be scrutinised in the light of the conditions at the time when the question is proposed to be posed. And if one follows what the Electoral Commission are saying, they use stronger language that the Commission firmly recommends that it must be required to provide views and advice to the Scottish Parliament on the wording of any referendum question. Again, I think they are the people who are the experts in this field, and we would defer to them.
And to give a live example of where a question has been improved before, the question initially proposed in the EU referendum bill in 2015 was a question that had been previously recommended by the Electoral Commission on the basis of question testing of a private member's bill. So that question was, should the UK remain a member of the European Union, yes or no? Although that question had been tested already, the Electoral Commission tested it again. And through that question testing process, they found that some campaigners had concerns with the word remain being in the question, and therefore they recommended that it be changed to the remain leave format that we ended up with. So there are opportunities for further improvement, and I think if it looks like that's being, if there's an attempt to kind of evade that, then that could be particularly problematic for a future referendum.
Thank you.
Of course, it was the Electoral Commission themselves who suggested the question that was used in 14. It wasn't.
Yes, absolutely. This is the point.
Yeah, but you know, would you expect then, in these circumstances, if the Electoral Commission were to test it, that in that testing process, that they would look at this is a question that people are familiar now with in Scotland. It's a question that's regularly used in polls. And would the Electoral Commission, in that context, given that backdrop, do you think that would be part of their, and I'm going to ask this question of them obviously, that would be part of how they go about that testing? Because to introduce something different now might actually confuse people. Yeah,
I certainly would expect that they would do that. They're part of their question testing process. They assess the intelligibility, and part of the way they do that is they kind of put the question in front of people and get people to vote. It's all about whether people understand the question they're being asked and are giving the answer that they wanted to give that indicates their actual preferences. So the way they do that is to go out and actually test a variety of questions with people. And certainly if it came from their evidence that people were confused by a different referendum question that was asking essentially the same question as the 2014 referendum but was worded differently, then they might recommend that it be that the same question be used.
Michael?
I'll wait and find out what the Electoral Commission say in answer to your question.
Okay, Gordon. It's Purda.
Over the last 20 years, the UK Act on referenda has been in place, and we've had 3 referenda during that period of time where the 28-day Purda period has been in place. There's been a suggestion that we should possibly have a longer Purda period than 28 days. What's your view?
Certainly, that is the recommendation of the Electoral Commission and also of the Independent Commission on Referendums, that the Purda period be extended to cover the whole of the referendum period rather than just the last 28 days. The IFG doesn't take an institutional view on that. There's a slight added complexity of having essentially two governments involved in potential future referendums, and there would need to be an agreement. If one were extended, it's likely that you'd also want another one to apply. Obviously, the difficulty is Scottish law couldn't bind the UK government, so it would have to be in the form of some other agreement. Like, as I say, the Institute doesn't take an institutional view, but certainly that is something that has been recommended by people who have looked at this quite thoroughly.
And we have not taken a view on the pre-election period at all.
Is that because you're broadly satisfied with the existing rules?
No, it's because we haven't considered it specifically as being an issue.
I should mention also that the Electoral Commission and the Independent Commission recommended that not only should the period be lengthened, but it should be narrowed in scope. At the moment, it applies to all publications related to a referendum, which for a functioning government could be difficult to sustain for a longer period of time. So it would need to be looked at. I think you need to look at both together, generally review what the purpose of that period is, whether it's doing exactly what it intended to do, which is ultimately to prevent governments from using public funding to intervene in referendum campaigns. And I think I suggest that the committee works with the Electoral Commission, who are essentially the experts, to see how that might best be achieved.
And having those two referenda guidance in place, and you said there would need to be some form of agreement between the two governments going forward if in any referendum where there was interested from both parties. What if that wasn't forthcoming?
I mean, that would be a difficult question and not one I think I have an answer to. I would hope that in good faith that there would be some sort of agreement. So, for example, or some alternative agreement. So, for example, in the 2011 Welsh referendum, the purdah period applied to the Electoral Commission asked both the Welsh Government and the UK Government to extend that period to the whole of the 28 purdah period to the whole of the referendum period. The Welsh Government did that. The UK Government didn't, but they agreed to remain neutral and didn't take a position in the campaign. So there are alternatives that might be slightly more difficult in other contexts. But it's something that I think would need to be, I mean, potentially talking about a future second independence referendum would need to be discussed as part of those negotiations on the process.
Okay, thanks very much.
Has anyone got any final questions? No. Okay, in that case, can I thank our witnesses for coming along today, providing some very useful evidence to us, and I now close this public part of the meeting. Thank you very much.